which can be alternated on the outside of the house. More important than that, it is not mutually exclusive, Mr. Speaker. We can have a motorbike like Tour de France and also cable coexisting. At the first rate, what is the unique benefit, and comparatively speaking, their benefit can be having on the outside, which is having the remaining, thank you, the unique benefit on the outside. So before we make an extension, yeah, Prime Minister.
Okay, assuming you can regulate every animal sport, and assume that even if with regulations, there are still abuses, a lot of abuses going on secretly behind the scene. Would you allow this sport, yes or no?
Secret abuse in fact a problem is not a criterion to ban the sport in and of itself. Clear answer. So extension. What is the benefits from the perspective of animal? We think the sense of animal protection is going to be instigated on our side because people engaging in animal sports, it's necessary treating those animals as a teammate, as necessary going to treat as cousins, brothers, small sisters, for example, Mr. Speaker. The friend of Fumiko has some kind of experiences of treating the horses as their sisters, for example. They necessarily instigate the human respect towards that. They're necessarily going to be coexisting, the form of coexistence with human beings. PETA, for example, can able to use and make a rhetoric to say with the visualized images of how human beings can cooperate and coexist by the human beings, laughing at the horse and people laughing at each other by his rhetoric, in order to protect the animal. And crucial thing is that being professional and being professional sports necessarily have a professional and prominent horse rider, or horse jockey, for example, like Chayapatra, for example, are able to cooperate volunteer charity protector in condition. For example, that's factually true. Chayapatra had called upon a volunteer charity in order to protect the environment in which horse is going to be facing. And because due to the professional sports, people are able to recognize how important, how prominent, how popular in society, that kind of rhetoric are able to protect it on our side of the house. More important, which was never engaged by that side of the house, is the sport is necessarily suitable to the natural instincts of animals. Siberian husky, horse in Mongolia, is necessarily going to be self-actualized with their maximum ability by having a sport. We don't think that's not an abuse. It is necessarily the self-actualization from the perspective of animal, and for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, side opposition is extremely hard to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for his speech. And for next speaker, I invite Rangponsumrit.
Humans are encouraged to strive to become moral beings and to achieve idealistic principles, not just to seem intellectual or intangibly good, but it is to set the foundation for practical interpersonal relationships on day-to-day basis that are driven by empathy, sympathy, and mutual respect. This is a point of view that we're trying to offer in today's debate that Opposition has not tackled, because we've told you that these kind of principles cannot be embodied by humans as long as sports that are centered around the sufferings of animals still exist, and that is why we from Proposition would like to abolish these sports in today's debate. Before I summarize the debate in 3 clash points, I'd like to start by making a few rebuttals. Firstly, right, on the concept of cultural relativism, right? Because on Opposition, they keep asserting that, these different cultures need to be respected and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, from side Proposition, we argue that these kind of values can and must be shifted in order for humans to reconcile those with the moral values that we're actually trying to achieve at the end of the day. Yeah. Because we think that some of these sports or some of these cultural values, like cockfights, or in terms of bullfighting, are inherently irreconcilable with the universal values and universal rights for animals and humans that we're trying to achieve in today's debate. We argue then that how to achieve those values when we still condone to these sorts of sports, right? They then go on to talking about, well, we can regulate it and all these sorts of things, which is kind of bizarre considering that they want to help animals but at the same time let it go. Which leads me to my second rebuttal on the concept of this whole regulation mechanism thing, which they've never clarified at the end of the day, right? We had 2 problems with that. Firstly, no thank you. We don't think that these regulations can occur because you cannot quantify or identify how much suffering these animals are going through. So at the end of the day, how would you regulate it, but you can't even tell if it's suffering or not, right? We think that that's something that's very problematic, and we think that because that's the case, we must assume that animals would suffer and thus err on the side of caution and not put them through sufferings from these kind of sports at all, right? B, second problem we have with it is something that's conceded already, right? That even if these sorts of suffering can occur, right? Because the nature of these sports is very multifaceted, right? It's very pervasive, right? It's very hard for us to sort of go in and regulate every single horse rings or whatever, or cockfight rings, to make sure that all animals would not suffer. So at the end of the day, we question both their principle and feasibility level. No, thank you. My next rebuttal on the concept of, we can treat these animals as teammates or whatever. We don't think that that's the case, and we think that's preposterous, because the nature of sports like this is you use them as tools, right? When you watch a cockfight, you're not using them, no thank you, as teammates when they're fighting each other and you're watching them suffer. What kind of teammates are those at the end of the day? And with that, we just simply think that that's factually incorrect and completely preposterous. Yes, I'll take your point.
So do you oppose pro wrestling because it goes against humanitarian values?
No.
Second, do we ask how before we compete? Is it okay to
Here's the thing, right? We've made this distinguishment time and time again, because there's a difference between using animals for recreational pleasures, which can be derived from other means, and using animals for necessities, right? We think humans deviate from using animals and hurting animals in times that they do not have to, which directly goes under this case, right? To my first class point, on the concept of the extent of rights of animals to life and well-being versus human rights to achieving recreational pleasure, right? The first question that we have to answer is whether or not this pleasure you can derive from these kind of sports, whether it's exclusive only to this. And we argue that it's no. We don't think it's exclusive, right? We think the inherent nature of pleasure that people derive from is the excitement and an adrenaline rush that they get from it. We think they can derive this from all sorts of things, right? They can ride on roller coasters, or they can even watch competitive sports in which athletes can deny certain sorts of practices and can tell people when they feel they've hit their limit and it's too much for them, right? We think that even if these sorts of pleasures were exclusive, we think that it's worth it for people to derive a slightly different type of pleasure from all those sorts of things, if that's for the benefit of not putting animal sufferings into the picture, right? Not at the cost of the sufferings of others. That's kind of the pleasure that we're willing to sacrifice, or we think that humans need to be able to sacrifice at the end of the day, right? Because we think that, which leads me to the concept of, animal rights at the end of the day, right? Because first of all, they argue that, these animals are not really suffering. No, we think it's completely ridiculous, because there's a difference between using animals for purposes at times to like drag sleds or whatever, and using animals primarily for this single purpose. Their whole lives revolve around this construction of them practicing eating certain diets and putting to difficult physical strains all the time, right? Because that we think is actually suffering at the end of the day. And we think that the most important thing is that there is no one who completely fully embody their needs at the end of the day. If you want to compare it to children, sure, it's a perfect example, because parents are able to embody those needs, right? But with these animals, no one is looking out for them. Thus, humans need to take that moral high ground. Which leads me to my second class point on why humans need to be able to take that moral high ground, right? Because we think there's no engagement coming from that side of the house. We've proven to you that compassion will be lessened because humans now feel distance from the sufferings of others, right? With animals that are now therefore linked to interpersonal relationships, because they feel now very complacent to all sorts of suffering, right? Because they feel distance from it. They think that it has nothing to do with it. We've also talked about how we need to extend these rights to animal because there's no one else who's going to do it for them, right? And it also leads to the concept of self-actualization, where humans can realize the moral values that they need to be able to achieve. With this, we also think it links to the concept that we need to be able to preserve, which links me to my last class point on the concept of the backlashes of abolishing these sports, right? Because they talked about this ridiculous concept of self-actualization of animals that need to be aided by humans. We say, hold on, self-actualization within their own refers to the concept of realizing the value naturally within your own means. They don't need to be able, horses don't need to be able to realize that they can run because humans make them. If they live naturally, they will be able to realize those sorts of concepts on their own. So with that, we think that that's completely false, and it's a weird logic at the end of the day, right? Because we think that Cyberson has been depending on this logic of just because something has been culturally done or done within the past, it should be continued. We don't think that that's the case, right? We think humans need to be able to realize that some rights need to be preserved, even if they're not as asking for it at the end of the day. Because we also talked about the concept of companionship through sports, right? This sort of companionship that, Thailand thinks will be deprived if we abolish these sports. We don't think that that's the case. We think it will actually enhance those sorts of companionship. Because it's not only about competition, but it's also about the values and the attitude you take towards those competitions in order to derive these sorts of companionships. And without the right values, we don't think any of these things can be done. Thus, I proudly beg to propose. Thank you very much.
I thank the government for her speech. Now for our next speaker, I invite opposition whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So today's government side repeatedly talk about how it is important for us to be aligned with the value of the sports, how the moral value, keeping the moral value is crucially important. But we couldn't understand what this moral value actually is, which is an extremely abstract concept. Given the fact that people living in the society have different sorts of needs, different sorts of ways of enjoying the sport, we think that banning sport, just because of this extremely abstract concept, a subjective concept called moral value, is extremely important. We couldn't see why, even if it's against their fairness or whatever, we couldn't see why this can be the reason for us to actually ban something that actually makes people extremely in a pleasure way. Well, we talked about how this is extremely tantamount to the animal abuses and how it's not, we shouldn't allow people to interact with animals as long as there's a crucial necessity. But we as a opposite side proved to you how enjoying or having pleasure is a fundamental right that human beings are actually guaranteed, and how it's a necessary part of our living. We think that there wasn't enough engagement coming from the other side. We think we should take this debate. So I like to look at this debate from three issues. Firstly, is this animal sports tantamount to the animal abuses like the government side said? Secondly, what's the line of banning sports? And thirdly, the necessity of having animal sports. So moving on to the first issue about how is it tantamount to the animal abuses. They give us actually three reasons why this is tantamount to animal abuse. Firstly, they talked about how this is actually unconsensual. Second of all, they talked about how people are desperate to win. Actually, that makes and restricts the animals, right severely. Firstly, on to the consent point. We can't see why the being unconsensual can be the reason for us to say that it is an animal abuse in the first place. Because whenever we live in a society in which we cannot avoid actually interacting with animal or utilizing animal, right? And whenever we interact with animal, it is impossible for us to actually verbally communicate with an animal. That means that therefore anything that we do to the animal is unconsensual. For example, eating animals or having them as a pet, or for example, using them in farming and so forth. We think that being unconsensual can never ever be the reason for us to say an animal abuse. So what's the line that we want to bring here? We think that when there's clear objective harm, physical harm that is imposed upon the animals, we think this is unnecessarily, that's the line that we would say animal abuses. Like for example, animals actually dying, for example, being killed, or for example, their heads are thrashed off. And these kind of cases are these objective physical harms are the thing that we would like to call the animal abuses, which was never engaged by the other side of the house. And second of all, they talked about how these people are because it's a competition, people are desperate to win, which makes them restrict the lifestyle of the animals so much. We think that untrue. We think that being in a competition is rather beneficial for these animals and try to make people incentivized to actually value the animals as much as possible. Why is that? Because in order for these animals to compete in a healthy way, they have to have healthy, for example, bodies, or they have to have enough physicality and stamina to actually compete, which makes for example, animal being fed is a much better situation compare to the animal left in the wild, like for example dying out, or so forth, right, Mr. Speaker? We talked to you how this is going to create, like for example, sense of attachment, sense of friendship. Although they talked about how they only objectify animal in this particular case, but given the fact that humans have like for example attachment towards, like tend to have attachment towards female, like towards for example your own teammates in the soccer team. If you constantly compete with your own, like for example animal, with for example trying to nurture this animal in a way that he is going to like can run faster, we think that this is going to naturally develop this sense of attachment, which is going to lead this, like for example, so the athletes not to abuse the animal, but for example treat him in a better way. We think it's totally not. So they talked about that, how like we don't allow, for example, for example, dog fighting and so forth. Obviously, we are totally opposed. Like my partners already told you, like the sports that actually objectively harm, like for example, lead animals to a death. We think that these things or animal abuse behind the scenes is something that should be regulated. Although they question that it is not regulatable, we think it's totally regulatable for several reasons. First thing we think that because we already have like a mechanism to regulate these, for example, abuses toward, for example, child amateur sport athletes, or for example, we try to have a lot of measures that like prevent these, for example, human beings athletes to be abused in the behind the scenes. We believe that these kind of like same mechanisms can be extremely applied here. Moreover, we would like to say that we think that although this, if we accept their like analysis about how it's impossible for us to regulate, then how is their motion actually going to work, right? Because according to their logic, if people are doing things all behind the scenes, in that kind of cases, we will still have, for example, black market in which these, for example, animals being constantly abused or constantly forced into these kind of bullfighting or constantly forced into dog fighting and so forth. We think that they're cutting their own workability by their own rebuttals. So moving on, but on the other hand, we prove to you how these people can actually, these animals are rather self-actualized by being like actually involved in the sport, being able to maximize their own potential. They talked about how they're just being forced and living in a wild situation is much better. But it's impossible for the animals living in its current society to live in a wild life, right, Mr. Speaker? Animals always have to coexist and live within the framework of human society. Given this limit of that animal has in this society, we think that this is the best way for the animals to self-actualize, being coexist with its human and being able to self-actualize at the same time. Because if they live in a wild situation, they're going to be caught because they will be too dangerous for us, or they're going to have the possibility to harm us. In that kind of cases, given this within the framework of coexistence, this is the best way for the animals. Moving on to the second issue, what's the line of banning sports? They talked about how this is going to be like we can ban things according to the universal values and how these kind of abhorrent culture actually exist. But we think that this is like extremely like abstract concept for us to actually make it the reason for us to actually ban certain kind of things. Given the fact that the different sorts of values exist and the sports exist for us to actually make us more pleasure, we think their like reasoning is not enough to protect this. Moving on to the third issue, necessity of having these animal sports. Although they talked about how these kind of things can be substantiated with other sorts of things, this is totally untrue, right? Because according to their logic, that all the sports have to be unified because all sports are about competition. Or sports are about giving out adrenaline. We've proved to you how, like, interaction with animals, or for example, nurturing the animals in a way that he can compete higher, is something that is a unique pleasure that stems from these culture itself. Although they said that recreation can never be the reason for us to actually use the animals, we think it's totally untrue, right? Recreation, firstly, proves to you how recreation can be one of the necessities that human beings have. Moreover, according to their logic, for example, eating caviar is also a recreation, right? Because people can live without eating caviar and so forth, right? Mr. Speaker, so for all these reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition for her speech. Now for next speaker, I invite our prize speaker for the opposition.
So I'm going to summarize the debate in 3 key areas because side proposition wants to debate in these 3 key areas. The first is about the principle of sports. The second is whether or not this very existence of sports at itself is necessarily going to be an animal abuse. And lastly, is there a need for this? Let's go to the first, into the principle of sports. Side prop has argued, look, the principle of sports is to respect others. That's the definition from Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. I agree, and let's examine whether respect really exists on our side. They said, people compete, so that therefore get to respect. We argue time compete, that is why people respect animal. Mr. Speaker, through a long discussion, constant, long time constant interaction with animal within the same competitive field necessarily instigate the sense of companionship and sense of family, kinship within the sports player as well as an animal. Also from the perspective of the viewers, for example, the surprise and we respect how much the animal can actually, how much powerful the animal is actually, and as how strong an animal is necessarily going to be strong, and I should respect the unique nature in which horses, in doggies, is able to have. Right? The point here, Mr. Speaker, and that is why we can have a respect of those for those animals on the ground. Right? And that is why, Mr. Speaker, the very existence of sports do not necessarily negate the value of the respect of others, Mr. Speaker. And also the principle, the universalization whatsoever, was not necessarily clear and comparative in today's debate. We told you from Witt's speech as well as my speech, we say the respect of other culture is also in fact a universal culture, as I told you in the point normation, which was never ever dealt with by that side of the house. And we think in comparison, Mr. Speaker, people have a right, because people have a right to have a luxury by eating animal, for example. That's an extension, and that's a kind of respect of culture, and we have to be comparable and to be prioritized in your adjudication. On a second level, in terms of animal abuse, in order for side proposition to ban in today's debate, is the very existence of sports necessarily entail a character of abuse. We have already negated this point for a number of reasons. With accordance to the criterion from PM and DPM, non-consensual thing is not amount to animal abuse. It is not the basis for moral condemnation on the basis of non-consensual thing, but it never dealt with in comparison on that side of the house. And with accordance to the maximization of potentiality, which is I gave you as a response, which was never dealt on that side of the house. But it's in order for animals to live and maximize the potentiality, they must live in a safe environment, good environment, to have a healthy life. Because animal can be consented to be a benefit by themselves. No animal wants to live in a harsh situation, Mr. Speaker, in comparison to the safe, nice, warm, the animal house in the paradigm of negative bench, right? And we think, even in the consent, we think such opposition is rather beneficial. Last is and also, we told you it's not necessarily a problem to regulate. We have an adjudicator and the judges in the dogfighting, and we have, Fumi told you, the professional to manage the animal thing is necessarily going to exist. Because we have the kind of regulatory framework in human sports, we think it is possible for us to impose in animal sports. Last, is there a need for this? Prop said there's other technology. I have told you it's not that mutually exclusive on today's debate. This is not necessarily a beneficial thing on that side. But the thing in which I have told you in my substantive point, why is it beneficial from the perspective of an animal to be protected, was never ever dealt by that side of the house. We need a professional sport because we have a professional figures in order to claim that we should protect an animal. We can refer to very other professional sports in order to really recognize the importance of coextensive culture between human beings and the animal. From these reasons, Mr. Speaker, with their logic and with their criterion, side opposition is going to win. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Speaker for his speech. Therefore, let's be going back to the Prime Speaker from the government bench.
Okay, so there's this massive tension that is bothering me. Had Fumiko took my POI, I would have pointed it out. They're standing at the same time for moral relativism, that every culture needs to be respected, but at the same time, they're saying that if there is objective physical harm, they're going to go against it. The logic is this, Mr. Speaker. They are saying if there's abuse involved to certain kind of animals, they're okay with abolishing that particular sports. At the same time, they're saying moral relativism is okay, but I don't know. But the logic is this. Then what we need to do is to prove to you why all forms of sports that involve animals is tantamount to abuse. And the best example of how this is abusive is their case. The idea that human can dictate what animal wants, that we know best and therefore we can dictate whatever the hell we want. We can decide how you want to self-actualize. We think those are the abuse that is occurring within human and animal relationship. And I'll prove that in, well actually yeah, this question, the whole concept of what exactly is the yardstick of us creating certain kind of animal rights. It has something to do with harm to consent, stuff like that. Right? When certain action is potentially and also harmful to animals, if there is no consent from the animals in doing this, we don't do that. Right? The logic is this. Because the purpose of this, in this particular context, the very purpose of animals are dictated by humans, that you must run fast in order for us to win and get prize money. Right? We think ultimately this is the abuse. Precisely because animals have zero capability to opt out from this kind of scenario. Whatever they do, whatever exclamation or squeak they do, human will say, oh, you're gonna be good and you're continue to do so, right? So here's the logic. It's abusive because animals cannot opt out from the framework human created. It's different from kids because kids can opt out, right? After they reach a certain age, they go out of their bloody family, and you know what? And even if they don't go out of the family, they can still rebel and they can still do what they want. Animals can't. That's the distinction. And especially when they need to go through stuff like death, injury, or extremely regulated lives, right? We think those are very unpleasant. And precisely when we don't know whether or not these animals are consenting, we must err in the side of compassion and caution at the same time. And say, look, if you're probably not going to like this, we're not going to do this, we're just going to take care of you. Things like that, because farms do exist. Second, there are certain instances where we do override these consents. That's when there is an absolute necessity, which we argue riding horses was an absolute necessity in the past, but not now, and especially not in the context of competitive sporting, right? Because there's zero necessity whatsoever. We use to ride horses as fast as we can. True enough, maybe they need to coexist, as Fumiko pointed out. But that doesn't mean that they must be regimented in order to compete. They can just stay in massive farms, so there are a lot of lands, say United States. So yeah, there is necessity for them to coexist, but not in this particular form. There isn't enough. And also, there are alternatives to serve the needs of people, right? Which response came in Fumiko also, I guess. But look, even if we cannot substitute the very basic idea of wanting adrenaline, we're totally okay with sacrificing those needs. Because these needs derive from the pain and suffering of other beings. We don't think we need to support them. We're willing to sacrifice that in the face of the moral values we would want. Okay, then they talked about regulations, right? That it doesn't work. Look, here's the logic. Human regulation works because humans can talk and can report if there are abuses. Animals can't, exactly like you said. But then the very notion of regulation in this debate is a bit different, right? It's about the regulation that exists during a training process or the upbringing. In those cases, well, the reason why abolishment works is because we cut the need to train to begin with. Because they don't need to regiment the large animals to compete because there is no bloody platform to compete. And if their argument is that argument, we say at least we're not subscribing or consenting to that. We think that's harder. Then lastly, why does all of this link to the purpose of sport? Is it about universal moral value, about compassion, respect, and fairness? Well, they are saying it's respect. But look, that nature of respect is also bad because you only respect those horses as long as they follow what you want, which is run as fast, right? True enough, there may be better form of relationship, but at the end of the day, it's still an abusive relationship where the human is dictating, we think that's abhorrent, and it also should not be included in this field of sports. Therefore, we're proud to propose.
Thank you, request to the government side, and all the speech over. For today.